Welcome to this week's episodes of Insights. This week's show is going to be entirely focused on the big issue, the big international issue that everyone's focused on, which is Ukraine, and the specifics of what's going on there and its greater impact on Armenia and our region. Let's just go over what we know so far. Obviously, yesterday was the first day of the war, and essentially Ukraine is being attacked from three sides, while at the same time, yesterday, it was very clear that they were trying to take out the entire air defense systems and the ability of the Ukrainian Air Force to operate, i.e. to dominate the air for the next few days, for as long as this war is going to go on. There's significant thrusts, attacks into the country, trying to occupy specific areas close to Russia, which are Russia populated. So there's heavy fighting going on there. It's clear that the Ukrainians are putting up a fierce struggle in many of these fronts. But the other thing, which is the most important thing, is there's a clear attempt by Russians to destroy all airports and to seize them as launching grounds, multiple airports around Ukraine, and to use them possibly to create regime change or to decapitate the government of Ukraine, which I think is something that militarily might be doable, but politically it would be very, very difficult to do. Now let's move on to what Armenia's response has been to this crisis and this war that's ongoing in Ukraine. All of this started obviously with the Russian recognition of the two breakaway republics in the Ukraine, which are Donetsk and Luhansk. And soon after that, the Armenian Foreign Ministry put out a statement that Armenia would not be joining Russia, essentially, in recognizing those two breakaway republics. Since then, up until today, it's fair to say that it's been radio silence from the Armenian side, and interestingly enough, also from the side of the Azeri regime. Essentially, nothing is being said. A couple of days ago, the president of the Artsakh Republic, Eric Hacopian, welcomed the Russian recognition of those two breakaway republics, which I can assure you was a mistake, because the Karabakh issue has a settlement format, which is the OSC format, which the Aliyev regime is trying to dismantle on a daily basis, and there's no reason for the president of Artsakh to give them an excuse to be able to further do that, especially at a time when it's clear that 90% of the world is not on the Russian side of this war. And more importantly, there's absolutely no political, legal, or moral ground to equalize the Karabakh issue with the Ukraine one, given the same disparity of views as I just outlined. Now I'm going to go over our sort of overall impressions of what all of this means or could lead to. One of the things that's clear that for Armenia's purposes, and frankly many other countries in our region, is that we're going to be squeezed further, and we're going to be squeezed by both sides, whether the EU, US side or the Russian side, to essentially choose sides. And it limits even the limited foreign policy options that we have on our own. That obviously is not something that is in any way a positive. The second thing is that this action is a clear breakdown of any kind of a rules-based international order. Now, why is that important? If you're a small country, if you're a weaker country, a rules-based international order is far more favorable to you than the opposite, in which essentially force is the primary dictator of all political and military disputes, which is obviously not a good thing for any small country. In some ways, our people tend to be the canary in the coal mine of history. The last century started with, in many ways, with the genocide of our people, and in some ways, the 21st century started with the first major war on European soil, which was in Artsakh. And many people who cheered on the Azeris, or actually refused to condemn essentially two fascist states attacking two democracies, are now all hell-bent on making the world condemn what is clearly the Russian aggression in Ukraine, which again is unacceptable and there's no context for it. But one has to understand that there are patterns here. If aggression is not condemned, and is set up as a way to settle disputes, one should not be surprised that other people will use that opportunity for their own purposes. Moving on to sort of what the driving force of many of this, how we even got to this moment in Ukraine is, there's a great deal of hypocrisy here. And as we know, part of what drove this is the orientation of Ukraine. And part of it was their desire to join NATO, which, theoretically every nation should have the right to make its own decision on which military blocs or which side they line up with. However, that's not how the real world works. And I can tell you, for example, if the Mexican government one morning decides to join CESTO and invites Russian troops to the American border, that Mexican government would last about 48 hours. So as we are condemning the Russian action in Ukraine, as we should understand that there's a larger context to it, as harsh or as cruel as that context can be. The biggest tragedy here is that all of this was avoidable. There was a solution to this issue, and I don't know if that really exists anymore on the table, which would be essentially the Ukrainian neutrality between East and West, rather than becoming a point of contention between East and West, for Ukraine to be a bridge between East and West, which would involve Ukraine not joining NATO, but having the ability to conduct its own affairs, control its territorial integrity, and again, not be a bone of contention. But all of this died essentially because maximalist positions on all sides, which made this impossible. In truth, what's really happening here is countries like Ukraine, which is the victim of the day, and countries like ours, we're sort of caught up in this pincer movement from both sides, and it's essentially two dominant ideas. From the Russian side, or specifically when you say Russian side, Russian policy is Mr. Putin, and President Putin is the one who establishes Russian policy in its entirety. It's a very clear attempt for Russia to establish a clear sphere of influence, which would cover almost the entirety of the Soviet Union, essentially the entirety of the former Soviet space, probably with the exception of the Baltic states, in which, essentially, Russia has veto power over the international and the foreign policy directions of all of these countries. Frankly, in the way that it does in Armenia today. It's sort of this Finlandization of this entire region. Obviously, this is not something that is acceptable or something that is desirable. At the same time, the countervailing force is the Western one, for whom there are many people in Washington and other places, and specifically in DC, in which the Cold War has never ended. And they are driven by this almost maniacal desire to constantly marginalize Russia and to push it into a corner and to humiliate Russia. You can write books about where this motivation comes from, but these are essentially the same people who today are very willing to fight the Russians to the last Ukrainian. The truth is that Russia is a great regional power, and it will continue to be that. It's a fact of history, and if anybody who tries to undo that, it will cause tensions that will lead to the situation that we're dealing with right now. In conclusion, what are we looking at? The world as we know it in the post-Cold War settlement sort of ended yesterday. Everything starts anew. We don't know what this world would be. It could be a much more difficult world. That's the most likely scenario. Or it could be something that creates a crisis that eventually brings in larger settlements that hopefully creates a more peaceful world. What is clear, however, is that the world, for the most part, lacks leaders who have the vision, the toughness, and more importantly, the hard-headed realism to actually come up with solutions to these issues rather than to take maximalist positions that have put us where we're at today.
Good to see you again.
I want to close with this. Many times we sort of lose the larger vision, the sort of the moral vision of these things. We talk about geopolitics, we talk about economics, but it is very hard not to be heartbroken by seeing the images that we've seen over the last 24 hours of pathetic-looking old people trying to escape burning buildings or long columns of cars leaving Kiev. As Armenians, we saw those images 2 years ago, and they were terrible, and frankly, they bring back terrible memories. And the one thing that I do know is, regardless of who's on what side, right now, it's probably both in Ukraine and in Russia, there's people in military uniforms visiting homes and letting parents and mothers know that their sons have died in war yesterday. And they might have different beliefs and they'll have different languages, but I can tell you one thing, that all of these mothers will cry in the same way. All of this is a terrible waste, and I hope it comes to an end soon. Thank you for joining me in this week's episode of Insights.